There is a room in the Egyptian desert that archaeologists have been arguing about for over 100 years, and the argument still isn't settled. It sits behind one of Egypt's most beautiful temples, sunk into the ground, half filled with water, built from stone blocks so heavy that modern engineers still ask how they got there. The men who first dug it out of the sand looked at it and said, "This doesn't belong to the king we were told built it." Then the establishment quietly overruled them. Today I want to walk you through exactly what was found, what the two competing explanations are, and why the single chamber at Abydos still refuses to give up its secret. Let's set the scene properly, because the location matters as much as the stone. The site is called Abydos, near the modern town of El Araba El Madfuna in Upper Egypt. For more than 3,000 years, this was the most sacred piece of ground in the entire country. It was considered the spiritual home of Osiris, the god of death, the underworld, and resurrection. Egyptians from every era made pilgrimages here. Kings from the very first dynasty, ruling around 3000 BCE, were buried in the desert nearby, and one of those early tombs came to be venerated by later Egyptians as the actual tomb of Osiris himself. This wasn't just another patch of sand. It was, in the Egyptian imagination, the closest place on earth to the afterlife. Standing above ground at Abydos today is the Temple of Seti I, a New Kingdom masterpiece dated to around 1300 BCE. Nobody disputes who built this temple or when. Every wall inside it is carved and painted. It houses the famous Abydos king list, a long inscribed sequence of royal names that historians still use to help reconstruct Egypt's dynastic order. It is exactly what you'd expect from a wealthy, confident empire at the height of its artistic power. But walk behind that temple, down a long descending passage, and you enter a completely different world. This is the Osireion. And where the temple in front of it is covered in decoration, the Osireion is almost totally bare. 10 enormous granite pillars, square, unadorned, support horizontal stone beams called architraves, some of which are estimated to weigh close to 100 tons apiece. There's no painted procession of gods here, no dense hieroglyphic text wrapping every surface. It's stark, heavy, and strangely quiet compared to everything around it. The Osireion was excavated between 1902 and 1903 by Swiss archaeologist Edouard Navel, working for the Egypt Exploration Fund, with a young Margaret Murray assisting under the supervision of Flinders Petrie, one of the founding figures of scientific archaeology. These were not fringe researchers. These were the people who helped invent the modern standards of excavation. And when they got down into that chamber, what they found didn't match the period they expected. Start with the granite itself. This is red granite, and it does not occur naturally at Abydos. Its nearest source is Aswan, roughly 250 miles to the south, at the first cataract of the Nile. To build the Osireion, workers would have had to quarry blocks in the range of 100 tons at Aswan, move them out of the quarry, transport them the enormous distance by river and land, and then lower them into a sunken chamber, and fit them together with a precision so tight that visitors are told, to this day, you cannot slide a knife blade between the joints. There's no mortar holding any of it together. It's stone fitted to stone by sheer skill. For comparison, so these numbers actually mean something, the average block in the Great Pyramid of Giza weighs somewhere between 2 and 15 tons. The largest granite beams roofing the king's chamber inside that pyramid are estimated at 50 to 80 tons, and those are already considered one of the great engineering feats of the ancient world. Some of the Osireion's architraves are estimated to exceed even that weight, and they weren't hoisted up the side of a pyramid using a construction ramp. They were lowered into a confined pit, at the level of the local water table, with none of the obvious advantages a builder would want. Then there's the water. When Navel's team opened the central hall, they found it already sitting below the water table, and to this day the floor of the central chamber holds standing water, with a raised stone platform in the middle often nicknamed the Osiris bed, rising out of the pool like an island. The standard explanation is that this flooding was intentional, meant to symbolically represent the primordial waters of creation in Egyptian mythology. It's a genuinely elegant idea, and it may well be correct. But it does sit awkwardly next to the obsessive precision of the stonework, because joints cut that tightly are usually the kind of craftsmanship meant to be seen and inspected in dry, open air, not permanently submerged where nobody could ever appreciate them. It's also worth knowing that the flooding has gotten measurably worse since the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the mid-20th century, which raised the regional water table and pushed more groundwater into the chamber than likely existed when it was originally built. So here's what Neville and Murray were looking at: a building style with no clear parallel elsewhere in the period it was supposedly built in, stone hauled an enormous distance and fitted with extraordinary precision, a chamber sitting in water despite craftsmanship that seems designed for dry display, and inscriptions that, to their eyes, looked like they'd been added after the structure already existed rather than planned into it from the start. When Neville published his findings in 1914, he stated plainly that he believed the structure predated the dynastic period entirely, that it belonged to an age before the Egypt of the pharaohs, as it was then understood. Murray, working a decade earlier under Petrie, had reached a similar instinct independently. Two trained excavators, working at different times, both pulled toward the same uncomfortable conclusion by direct contact with the evidence. That view held for a while, but by the 1920s a different reading took over, and it's the one that ended up in the textbooks. Egyptologist Henri Frankfort, who excavated the site through much of that decade and published his conclusions in the early 1930s, argued that the Osireion was a cenotaph, a symbolic, empty tomb built for Seti I. His argument deserves real credit, because it's more careful than the early excavators were simply wrong. Frankfort openly acknowledged that the Osireion looked nothing like the temple in front of it, that it was stark, massive, and archaic in feeling. His explanation was that this was deliberate. Seti, building a monument dedicated to the god of death and rebirth, intentionally imitated an older, heavier, more primordial architectural style to connect his monument to a sense of deep antiquity. The plainness was a choice. The flooding was a choice, meant to evoke the waters of first creation. It's a genuinely clever theory, and for the better part of a century it's been the accepted one, printed in guidebooks and taught as settled fact. But it's worth being honest that the theory doesn't erase every question, it just answers some of them while leaving others open. Look closely at the inscriptions bearing Seti's name, since they are the actual anchor for the whole attribution. They don't appear woven into a planned decorative scheme the way inscriptions do in the temple next door. Some appear on surfaces that look like they were finished and smooth before any text was added, which is at least consistent with the idea that the carving came later, whether that means a different era, or simply that decoration in this chamber followed a very different design philosophy than the temple in front. That ambiguity is exactly why the debate has never fully closed. There's also the question of parallels. If Seti's builders had the ability to quarry stones on this scale, move them 250 miles, and fit them with this level of precision, you'd generally expect to see traces of that skill elsewhere in the New Kingdom record, in other projects from the same workshops. Across the wider architectural record of the period, this exact combination of technique doesn't show up again in quite the same way. Defenders of the cenotaph theory would say that simply because this was a unique, one-time commission with a unique symbolic purpose, and one-off feats of engineering aren't unheard of in ancient construction. Skeptics of that explanation find the uniqueness itself suspicious. Both positions are reasonable responses to a genuinely strange set of facts, and neither one has fully closed the case. Then there's the scale of the space itself. The doorways are reported at over 12 feet tall, and the passages and chamber heights are large enough that a person standing in them looks small relative to the architecture. Some point to this as evidence the space was built for something other than an ordinary human ceremonial function, or was built to older proportions than everything around it. Others point out that oversized, monumental proportions were a fairly normal way for Egyptian builders to signal grandeur and divine importance, especially for a shrine tied to the king of the underworld, regardless of who was actually going to walk through it. It's also worth mentioning, for the sake of giving you the full picture, that ancient writers themselves noticed something odd here. The Greek geographer Strabo, visiting Egypt in the 1st century BCE, described structures at Abydos as already ancient in his own time, without crediting a specific New Kingdom pharaoh. That doesn't prove an earlier date on its own. Ancient authors weren't always accurate about the age of monuments they saw, but it does show that even people standing there 2,000 years ago found the place difficult to place in time. So where does that leave us? The honest answer is that mainstream Egyptology overwhelmingly attributes the Osireion to Seti I, most likely completed or finished under his son Ramesses II, as a cenotaph deliberately styled to look primordial and connect the king to Osiris and the concept of first creation. That is the well-supported, peer-reviewed position, and it's not something that's seriously in dispute among professional Egyptologists today. At the same time, some of the specific engineering questions, exactly how stone of that mass was transported and set with that level of precision, and exactly what the relationship is between the earliest carved inscriptions and the structure's actual construction sequence, are still debated in the details even by scholars who fully accept the New Kingdom date. Fringe theories that push the structure thousands of years earlier, into a supposed lost pre-dynastic civilization, are popular online, but they aren't supported by excavated evidence, and no credible archaeological find has ever backed them up. What is true, and doesn't need any exaggeration to be fascinating, is that this is one of the most technically demanding stone structures in the ancient Nile Valley, sitting in near total silence right behind one of Egypt's most celebrated and heavily documented temples, and the full story of exactly how it was built is still being pieced together. That contrast, right next to each other, one building shouting its own history in paint and relief, the other saying almost nothing about itself, is what keeps people coming back to this site. Whatever the final word on the Osireion turns out to be, it's a reminder that even in one of the most studied civilizations in human history, there are still rooms in the sand that haven't finished telling us what they are. If you want me to walk through another site with a genuine unresolved debate behind it, tell me which one in the comments, and I'll go stand inside it next.